Somehow I haven't talked about the anatomy of the skin yet, which is ridiculous because the skin is a whole system all on its own, the integumentary system. It's also the largest organ in the body. I noticed because I was looking at my list of introductory topics and systems, and we're also teaching skin this week, and noticed I haven't done it properly. We talked about the external ear, a bit of skin there, but we should cover the anatomy now, or rather I should say, we could talk for hours about the anatomy of the skin, so I think we should probably consider this an introduction to the anatomy of the skin. We'll talk about its functions, we'll consider the anatomy in terms of layers, how the skin is a little bit different around the body, and a few clinical bits and bobs. The skin then covers us, obviously. Animals evolved in a salty sea. We now carry that salty sea around inside us. The basic chemistry of our cells relies on water and salts at just the right concentrations and just the right pH for everything to work. So one of the major functions of the skin is to keep that water in, to keep the water and salts and that solution inside us. It is then a barrier between our insides and the outside environment. So it's a barrier in terms of waterproofing, but also pathogens, microbes. It stops pathogens from getting into the body. It also protects us, mechanically from mechanical abrasion. It protects us from radiation like ultraviolet light. It's important in temperature regulation. There is an insulation layer of fat, which is also an energy storage layer. There is water stored in the skin. The blood flow to the skin can be regulated to change the rate at which heat is lost, to either keep heat in the body or get rid of heat. There are sweat glands and sebaceous glands, and those sweat glands will put moisture on the surface of the body and more heat will be lost through evaporation. There is hairy skin. Well, pretty much all of the skin has hair, is hairy skin. Some regions of the body have more hair than others, and that hair is also important in temperature regulation. It can be an insulator, and when wet it can help with cooling. The skin is a sensory organ. Most of our sensory apparatus is externally facing. It's sensing the environment around us, and we're well aware how the skin is filled with sensors for pressure and touch and pain and temperature, and we know what it's like when something itches because we think something's landed on the skin, all of those things. So the skin is covered in sensors, and the skin it can do things like it has a role in vitamin D synthesis. So producing the active form of vitamin D is quite a long chain of events, and the skin has a role in that. And vitamin D then is involved in regulating the amount of calcium in the blood, another one of those molecules that needs to be at just the right level for cells around the body to function. Calcium, of course, is involved in bone, so that's important in bone health, and also in metabolic regulation, let's say. So the skin has a number of functions. Skin isn't the same all around the body. You can see that when you look at skin. We have hairy skin, which covers most of the body. We have hairless skin. We have thick skin and thin skin. And that hairy skin, the amount of hair varies around the body. Why that is not entirely clear, but as I said, hair has a role in thermoregulation. Also seems to have social roles. Hair can have a sensitivity role, like your eyelashes. It can also have a protective role, like your eyebrows stop things going into your eyes. And there's one of those social applications of hairy skin. But humans seem to have patches of patches of skin with lots of hair, with a high density of hair follicles, and then a large amount of skin which has a lower density of hair follicles, and some parts of the body which are hairless. So the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, the lips are hairless. You can imagine that would give a better grip. But also if we think about thick skin and thin skin, if we look at the histology in here, and we'll talk about the layers in a moment, thick skin has a thicker epidermis. which is kind of like, well, it is the tough layer, the layer which withstands abrasion. So thick skin on your hands and on your feet makes sense because it'll withstand more abrasion because you're walking on your feet, you're using your hands. And because of that thicker epithelium, that thicker epidermis layer, it has an extra layer called the stratum lucidum. And there are sweat glands, but there aren't any hairs, there aren't any sebaceous glands, which tend to be associated with hairs. So maybe it's just a side effect of being thicker and abrasive skin rather than being hairless to give more grip. Who knows? This is a model of the skin. That's the surface. There are the hairs coming out of the surface of the skin, and this is going deep into the skin, so going that away. And this is showing the layers of the skin. This is what the skin is made up of. Understanding the cells of the skin, the layers of the skin, let us understand a lot about the function of the skin and what goes wrong. You know, when we get redness with inflammation and rashes and blisters and skin cell count, all that sort of stuff, you have to understand the cellular structure. So this is the nuts and bolts of the issue. There are 3 layers to the skin. The most superficial layer up here, so the surface is here, this layer here, this is the epidermis, this is the outermost layer. This is the dermis here, and then this is the hypodermis or the subcutaneous fascia down here. It's the epidermis, which is the bit that we can see, and the epidermis is a stratified squamous keratinized epithelium, I'll explain that, with other layers within it. Anatomists and histologists love describing layers. So a stratified squamous keratinized epithelium. Okay, so an epithelium is a sheet of cells. It's cells forming a sheet. You can make a lot of structures in the body with sheets which make tubes and so on and so on. So an epithelium is a common cell type throughout the body. Stratified means there are multiple layers. Squamous means it's a flat cell, so not like a rectangular cell or a cuboidal cell. It's a squamous cell, so we see lots of layers of flat cells forming sheets in here. Stratified squamous. Keratinized means that as we get closer to the surface, we find that the cells here have had their inside scooped out and replaced with keratin, almost. And they're surrounded by lipids and proteins. So the cells are not living cells anymore. They're filled with keratin, which is a tough fibrous protein, which gives us a tough fibrous covering, a waterproof covering, and the cells are stuck together really well. So that keratinized bit means that we've got tough layers of cells protecting our external surface. In this epidermis, this stratified squamous keratinized epithelium, most of the cells in here are keratinocytes. There will be some melanocytes. They make melanin. They put the pigment in the skin that helps protect us against ultraviolet radiation, gives the skin color. There will be some immune cells in here, and there will be some sensor cells, like pressure sensor cells in there. The dermis then is a support layer for the epidermis. In the dermis we see blood vessels, we see nerves. Look, we can see the hair follicles and the hairs coming out. We can see the sweat gland is in the dermis. If there are any sebaceous glands, they'd be secreting into the hair follicles, they'd be in the dermis as well. So the dermis supports the epidermis. And then the hypodermis, below the dermis, this is where we find that fat store. We find more blood vessels, more nerves, we've got more sensors around here. That's the subcutaneous fascia, that's a support for the dermis which supports the epidermis. So we have layers upon layers, and we can look at this in more detail and look at layers within the epidermis. Now you can see that the interface between the dermis and the epidermis is wiggly. We have a load of ridges, but they're 3D ridges, so they're interdigitated. So there's a really good connection, a really good surface area that's good at coping with shear forces, right? There is a basement membrane between the dermis and the epidermis. That just means, again, there's a sheet made of collagens and connective tissues separating the two. And with the epidermis, the most important idea is that here, this is the surface of the skin, this is in contact with the world, and the cells on this surface here get shed away. We know this, we see it happening. My PC's full of it at home. This is where you hoover. Yeah, dust at home is mostly skin cells, right? So the idea is that this surface layer is abraded away. So we lose cells from this end, which means that down here, the epidermis is continually making new cells. So it's making new keratinocytes here. So this is the basal layer. This is the stratum basale, the basal layer, also known as the stratum germinativum. It's like a germinating layer. Down here we find the progenitor cells, the stem cells of the epidermis, epithelial stem cells. So they are constantly dividing mitotically to produce new cells, and those new cells will pass up through the layers to the surface and be lost. And the stem cells stay down here, but the other cells they produce will continue. As those cells extend up here, they pass into the stratum spinosum. It's called spinosum because they look spiky. The cells are looking spiky because they're starting to stick together really well. And by sticking together really well, they're going to make that waterproof barrier, right? The next layer is the stratum granulosum. They look a bit granular under the microscope. So what's happening here is the cells are starting to be filled with keratin proteins, and they're starting to surround themselves with those proteins and lipids that are also going to make this layer waterproof. So the cells are becoming flattened, they're becoming squamous. And then after that, they move into the stratum corneum. So the corneum is like the hard, corny layer, right? The cells in the stratum corneum are now filled with keratin. They haven't got any of their cellular machinery inside them anymore. They're just dead cells filled with keratin, making this physical barrier by making layer upon layer upon layer of cells which are all tightly adhered to one another. In between the corneum and the granulosum, that's where we'd find the stratum lucidum in thick skin of the palm of the hand and the sole of the foot. It looks quite clear under the microscope. So thick skin isn't necessarily the thickest skin in total. Thick skin is the skin that has the thickest epidermis, the layer that's actually doing all that mechanical work, and it has that stratum lucidum layer. So because this is hairy skin, this is thin skin, we're not seeing the stratum lucidum there. But that's the epidermis. The dermis then has two layers, a little bit simpler. We have the papillary layer and the reticular layer. As I said, that papillary layer has that tight adhesion to the epidermis. There's loads of collagen in here, as well as those blood vessels and nerves and all these other bits and bobs that I talked about. So this is the collagenous, the support tissue. And as we get down here into the reticular layer, we see more collagen. We see, there's that sweat gland. We see more, have we got one here? Or there are often more mechanoreceptors down here. But the dermis then, being the highly collagenous support layer for the epidermis, this is what's giving the skin some of that support, that shape. As we age, particularly with gravity, as we age, the cells that maintain the connective tissues of the dermis and most parts of our body, they're not as good as they were. They're not making as much collagen, and these layers can get a little bit thinner. So our skin starts to get wrinkled, everything starts to sag because of gravity, because the skin isn't quite as stretchy and tight as it used to be. So if you want to look young forever, the dermis is your target, and our favourite molecule, collagen, type 1 collagen. Be wary of what people try to sell you for your skin. Anyway. Down here then is the hypodermis. We see a lot of fat down here, a lot of blood vessels. We see the hair follicles extending down into there. This is the same thing as the subcutaneous fascia. And that is the skin. Okay, with that knowledge, what do we now know clinically? Blisters. What's a blister? That's in the skin. Well, a blister is a separation of some of these layers allowing fluid to collect between those layers and start to swell. Because this area is filled with mechanoreceptors, that swelling starts to compress those mechanoreceptors, so it can be very painful. Often this is because of shear forces have separated the epidermis from the dermis there. So the blister can form in that layer, but it can form within other layers as well. And again, we're probably aware of blisters on our feet when the skin has been rubbing against another surface. So can you see how you've got that shear force is trying to separate those layers? Inflammation and redness, well, we see lots of blood vessels here, and the flow of blood through these blood vessels is carefully controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. If we're hot, more blood flows to the surface of the skin and we radiate out heat. If we're cold, less blood flows to the surface of the skin and we try and keep our heat. Inflammation, so an immune response for whatever reason, maybe there's a local insult, a local injury, or a chemical or something. Inflammation causes redness because it's causing an increased blood flow to the area, so it goes red, same as blushing when you're embarrassed or something like that, right? Rashes are similar. You often see redness with rashes because you're getting, there's an immune thing going on here. There's an insult to the skin, so you're getting increased blood flow and you're getting fluid collecting in some spaces, causing those shapes that we see as a rash, those little bumps, right? There are lots of mast cells in here, and cells of the immune system can access this area. We talk about the lymphatic system quite a lot. And the lymphatic system is actually collecting fluid from subcutaneous tissues, because if the skin is broken, pathogens can then enter. Those pathogens can get picked up by the lymphatic system, then they'll pass to a lymph node, which is where the immune system lives. The immune system can then recognize and respond to those pathogens if they've broken through the physical barrier of the skin, right? Now that we've talked about the structure of the skin and the functions of the skin, it's clear why burns are so dangerous. Burns can remove different layers of the skin, depending on how serious the burns are, over potentially a significant region of the body. If you've lost the skin, there's an increased risk of infection, because infection can get past this physical barrier now. The skin keeps your water in, so now you're struggling to manage and maintain the water and salt concentrations inside your body, which can lead to shock and death. Of course, if the burn is deep enough, if the burn has removed the stratum basale, the stem cell layer, well, the epithelium can't grow back here, because there are no stem cells to grow back from, which means there's going to be a lot of scarring. Collagen fibers are going to get thrown across this wound, fibroblasts are going to manage all of this, and then skin will be put on top, but it's going to be heavily scarred, which changes the nature of the skin. It makes it stiff, it makes it harder to move, and it's going to change the way the skin looks, of course. So burns are really dangerous. Also, because we now know about the cells of the skin, we can better understand skin cell cancers. The skin is exposed to ultraviolet radiation. Well, not so much in Wales at the moment. But potentially the skin is exposed to ultraviolet radiation, which damages DNA. We have a layer of cells here that are constantly producing new cells. So they're replicating their DNA, there are lots of replication controls to make sure that cells are replicated correctly and the rate of replication is carefully controlled. But if ultraviolet light is damaging the DNA, it could damage those controls. Now, if the epithelial cells start to divide a lot more than they should in an uncontrolled manner, a tumour forms, a cancer. If the cells of that tumour are likely to be able to spread to other tissues, then that's a malignant tumour. This was an epithelium, right? If a malignant tumour forms from an epithelium, it's called a carcinoma. And there are more than three, but there are three skin cancers that we worry about. So we have Basal cell carcinoma. Oh, we know what that is. So the basal cells are down here because this is the basal layer, right? So a basal cell carcinoma forms from these stem cells in the basal layer. This is deeper in the skin, which means that growth is going to look a bit different because these cells look a bit different, right? These cells, this sort of tumour, this basal cell carcinoma, it can metastasize. I think it tends to be slow growing, slow spreading. Because the other advantage of it being in the skin is you can see it because you can see your skin. So unlike a cancer that grows inside the body, which can be impossible to spot until it is already spread, cancers in the skin, you can spot because you can see most of your skin or somebody else can see the skin that you can't see for you, right? So a basal cell carcinoma is forming from the cells in the basal layer. A basal cell carcinoma is the most common skin cancer. It's slow growing. It can metastasize, but it's less likely to than some of the others. And it can be spotted because it's in the skin, it's on the surface of the body. A squamous cell carcinoma, oh, well, we know where the squamous cells are, they're up here. So a squamous cell carcinoma is forming from these layers up here. It's a little bit more superficial. These are more likely to metastasize, but again, you can see them because they're in the surface of the skin, and this is curable. You can remove these. The third common type is a melanoma. A melanoma is the most dangerous form of skin cancer. It forms from melanocytes, which are not, strictly speaking, part of the epithelium, so this isn't a carcinoma. This is hence melanoma. The melanocytes are also in the basal layer. They're mixed up in there. As I said earlier, the melanocytes are responsible for making melanin, the pigment of the skin, to protect us from ultraviolet radiation. If a melanoma forms, those cells are pretty good at metastasizing and quite quickly, which is why they're dangerous. They're usually pigmented. Again, they're in the skin, so they can be seen most of the time. They can kind of form in hard to see areas. And because there are other cells in here, those other cells can potentially form tumours. So there are other forms of cancer, but those are the three main types. Okay, so we've looked at the skin. We understand the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis layers. We've seen that there's a couple of layers making up the dermis, and we have a lot of these great structures in here and lots of collagenous support material, and that the epidermis is actually made up of a number of layers, the most important idea being that we have stem cells in the base which are continually producing new cells that move towards the surface and are lost. And all of this gives us the functions of skin which are vital for life. Okay, there is so much to talk about with skin that I guess I could come back and talk about specific things in more detail later. See you next week.